On this episode of the WildFed podcast,
I'm out to consume mass quantities. I've been eating venison, lamb, and mutton all winter. I want to get out and just eat big bowls of plants.
It's about to start, and there's going to be no shortage of stuff, and this season goes fast.
The best part about ramps for me is the giant green leaves. Think about cooking them as a vegetable.
I do want to talk about Bracken Fern because it's such a misunderstood food.
If we can take invasive species and turn them into a cash crop, I do not see any problem with that at all.
I do love the idea of an invasive onion.
What is organic? All the big companies. Is there a new certification that needs to come out? Wild food is just wild food.
I really do imagine a world where people are practicing a kind of wild-tended permaculture conglomerate, creating little native ecosystems around themselves.
It's more than like a novelty. Don't bring a small basket. Don't think of it as like going for a hike. You're going to the grocery store. So be prepared to do some shopping.
Episode 126 of the WildFed podcast, Spring Greens. It's like going to the supermarket with Alan Bergo is brought to you by Surthrival. I've been using colostrum daily and promoting it as a powerful nutritional supplement for over 15 years. In fact, I just had a quarter cup in my blended drink this morning. With its ability to fortify your immune system, nourish and rebuild your gut lining, repair injuries, aid in muscle growth and recovery, and so much more, I think it's one of the most sophisticated supplements we can work into our diets. Surthrival is already known as the #1 source for premium colostrum, and now Surthrival's just released 3 new formulas: naturally flavored colostrum in chocolate, vanilla, and strawberry. They're lightly sweetened with monk fruit and combined with MCT oils to make them more soluble in water and blended drinks, all while having the same potency of Surthrival's original formula. These flavored colostrum powders are so good, I keep eating them by the spoonful right out of the tub. In fact, the amount I ate the day they first arrived was probably a little over the top, but I had to test them rigorously. I'm guessing I ate 5 cups or more. Eaten like that, they're like a powdered ice cream, but of course, they make great blended drinks too. By the way, these aren't those fake flavors you taste in so many supplement powders. These are flavored with real cacao, vanilla, and strawberry, so they taste great and really clean too. Right now, they and all the colostrum products at surthrival.com are 20% off with the coupon code RESTORE. This is Surthrival's biggest colostrum sale of the year, so don't miss out. Head over to surthrival.com to get yours today. Hey, are you a small business owner in the wild food space or a hobbyist forager looking for a side hustle? Then listen up. This episode's brought to you by foraged.market, a website for buyers and sellers of wild and specialty foods from around the globe. Think Etsy, but for foods with a story. But it gets better. Not only do you get your own product page to promote your goods, they expose you to a constant stream of ideal buyers, foodies, chefs, and restaurants looking for raw ingredients or value-added products just like yours. Go over to foraged.market/wildfed to get started. While you're there, you'll also find a coupon for $10 off your first order of any of the incredible products there from other sellers. Foraged.market. Buy there, sell there, and learn more about their incredible vision and conservation ethic by listening to episode 122 of the WildFed podcast. Foraged.market, the global marketplace for wild and specialty foods. I'm Daniel Vitalis, and you're listening to the WildFed podcast, a show about reconnecting with nature through hunting, fishing, foraging, and food. WildFed. Food is all around you. The early spring green foraging season is upon us, or at least it's drawing very close now. And who better to talk to than the Forager Chef himself, Alan Bergo. Alan's a longtime guest and friend of the show, both the WildFed podcast and the television show, and one of today's most prolific wild food writers and recipe developers. His website, foragerchef.com, is the web's largest wild mushroom cookery resource, but it's so much more with incredible recipes and musings on plants as well. Alan's constantly experimenting with old and new ways of processing, cooking, fermenting, pickling, or preserving wild edibles, and is always on the quest for new flavors too. After a long Northern Hemisphere winter, there's nothing as cleansing and rejuvenating as those early spring greens, and Alan's going to give us lots of tips and tricks on what to do with them. We also talk about the rise of wild foods and foraging in television media, and get some teasers about a new mainstream TV project he's recently gotten involved with with, which will be coming out soon. For those of us in the wild food space, this is an exciting time, both because of spring greens, but even more so because many prominent wild food educators and personalities are producing media that has the potential to bring what we do to larger audiences, hopefully helping to mainstream the idea that wild nature and humans have always had and should have today an intimate reciprocal relationship based around food. More people caring about what wild nature has to offer means more people caring for wild nature. And eventually, we all hope that leads to more wild nature. Alan is playing an instrumental part in that and continues to innovate, be curious, and perpetually inspire us on the topic. Alan Bergo, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. Good to be back.
You know, I think I've been thinking about it. You're definitely one of the people who's appeared the most on this podcast. So I want to say thank you for that. And it speaks to the depth and breadth of your knowledge on these topics, man. So it's just always great to have you.
I'm honored.
Well, I'm honored too, man. You know, I was thinking maybe to start off, I'd just like to get a quick, maybe like a brief synopsis of what you do and kind of how that's been informed by, your work in the past and stuff.
Yeah, sure. Well, I worked in professional kitchens for about 15 years, and I saw eventually as I got to nicer and nicer places that the highest quality ingredients, the most expensive ingredients, they were all wild coming into these places that I was working at. And I started to teach myself about them to bring them into the restaurants I was working at and then the restaurants that I ran afterward.
Man, it's something we've talked about a bunch of times, but it's never really left my mind. You had at one point called it the final frontier of food. And that still just really sticks with me because I'm really seeing it now. Even from when you and I first met, we made an episode of WildFed, the TV show together, and we've done a bunch of podcasts now. Even from back then when we first connected, seeing where the wild food kind of culture is at today. And I'm curious if you see this as well. It seems just like on a really strong growth curve, maybe kind of like how organic was for me growing up and watching that become this like mainstream idea. I'm seeing wild foods get more and more, just kind of come into the collective zeitgeist a little bit more.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think you and I have seen there's been a huge interest. It just seems to build every year. And I mean, personally, I think it's probably in a better place than organic with there's all kinds of stuff about now, like, oh, what is organic? All the big companies have stuff that's like technically organic, but it shouldn't be organic. Is there a new certification that needs to come out? Wild food is just wild food.
Yeah. Well said, man. And before we move on to, could you say a few words about your book? Because you wrote a cookbook that I just feel is kind of a cut above the sort of, I don't know, I think sometimes people feel like they just need to write a book and, to go with their influencing work or whatever it is. But your book is more than that. And I think it's just an incredible contribution to the wild food literature. And so I just want to give you some space to maybe mention what that is and how people can see it if they want to get access to it.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So it's called the Forager Chef's Book of Flora, and it's basically the first in a 3-part series. The next will be on mushrooms and then on meat, flora, fauna, and fungi, respectively. And it's all about wild plants, but also how working with wild plants kind of informed and educated me and showed me different things about garden vegetables and herbs. And there's a whole section on nuts and starches. And it's really kind of a deep dive into wild food, working with specific plants, working generally with lots of different plants. And there's a lot of stuff on, wild greens specifically, and a lot of specifically cultural references that really showed me a lot that I didn't know before. Like when I was working in kitchens, one thing that I found myself trying to do all the time, I felt pressed and pushed to like be really innovative, like, okay, we got to take these greens and, transform them somehow. And especially as I wrote the book, I started to see more and more in my style, how I work, cook, and enjoy the plants, that I try to transform them less and less. And more and more, I just want to enjoy them simply and enjoy their individuality. And looking at traditional recipes of plants, how people cook wild plants around the world, it really changed how I work with wild plants and enjoy them much for the better.
Man, that's what's really interesting to me about it. And just so people know, what I want to talk about today are, because we're having this as I'm sort of looking out my window and just seeing things drip, drip, drip as they melt away, and we move towards the early shoots of springtime, which is coming real soon here. So I want to talk about those early spring greens and some ideas about working with them. But I just want to go back to what you just said, because I was really impressed with how much you had done to look at the wild food and cuisine of other cultures, and you dug kind of deep into some stuff. Like, it's interesting what you're saying, because you do see that today. Everybody wants to turn things into some kind of gastronomic foam or something, but like this work you're doing, even though like that's considered innovative, in a way I found your original research very innovative. Like, going back and looking at some of this stuff, you went a little bit deeper than most people are willing to go. I think something that characterizes your work to me is that you have just like a tier deeper. You go a tier deeper into everything, whether it's mushrooms or whether it's plants, than most people do. I'm curious if you want to talk about your process, because you were some of the references that you were going to the last time I saw you were pretty arcane. Like, you went back into some things where you were translating other languages and things like that. It wasn't like you just picked up all of the common wild food books and then you're like, okay, this is going to be my section on the goosefoots. You went pretty deep. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I mean, the wild food books, they can only really, as far as what I can see, they can only help you go kind of so far. A lot of them cover like very similar things, and you really need to get into some different references to kind of break the status quo a little bit. So, I mean, the Mediterranean is just it's just a host of all kinds of resources on tons of different plants that are eaten. So, one of the things that's been most helpful for me, I mean, there's like scientific studies, one that's funded by the EU, and some more of like the academic literature. You're not going to go through these books and even understand, at least me, I can't even understand half of the stuff in the science speak that's in there. But because I know some Latin names, just seeing that a plant is eaten can be a starting point. And
Yeah.
seeing all these big lists, like, oh, here's a list of 80 plants that are eaten in the Mediterranean. Then I can take those individual Latin names and search on them or consult one of my other books. And it can really help you break into new territory. Like just this morning, I was looking back at a book that's not a scientific book. It's called It's by Patience Gray, and it's called Honey from a Weed. This is like a classic that a lot of foragers that I know like, and I always seem to find like a new thing just when I'm paging through it. And today I was reading about wild poppy greens, and also a plant that a lot of herbalists will know that most people will say, oh, you can't eat. She actually has a traditional recipe using comfrey leaves.
Hmm. Oh, wow.
Yeah, so I mean, there's all kinds of examples like that. Like the small amount of wild greens that, most of the wild food books are going to cover. There's just so much more. But
That's
you got to dig
something
for it a little bit.
that's something that I realized being out there with you. I mean, when I came to visit, we harvested some greens like watercress. That's like one that most people coming into the foraging world are going to learn. It's common. It's easy to identify. It tastes great. It's like, that's a fantastic green. But then there was all these things that you were into that I was like, oh, really? That? Like, I'd never heard of. What is this? And then you were also playing with a lot of parts of the plants that maybe people wouldn't necessarily think of too. So yeah, I really appreciated that. So that's kind of leads me into where we're headed into the spring, because I'm curious what's on your mind. Like, what are you getting excited about, and what's going to be coming up through the ground? You're kind of in a part of the country too where a lot of what you have there, people in far flung parts of the country are also going to have, because you're kind of like right there in the middle. So there's stuff that's there that's here in Maine and is also in California, and it's like kind of convenient in that way, and it's down in the south. So like, what's coming up soon for you guys, and what are you looking at playing with in the coming months?
Well, like the first things to come up, we'll have ramp leaves poking out of the soil, and typically the first plant I'll eat is watercress because we have a spring where the watercress it'll be around. I mean, through the entire winter, but it'll be below the water line. It'll be it'll have a lot of roots on it, so I don't eat tons of it. But nettles and watercress will be the first thing that I eat, to go back and now talk about some really common edibles. And there's a couple things with nettles, again, touching on the cultural references and traditional cooking. You find a reference, when I find a reference for something for just like a common plant that I cook all the time, like nettles, it can completely change how I think about the plant and how I enjoy it. So they're a really good example. I was reading a book on Turkish cooking last year, and it completely changed how I enjoy my nettles most of the time. So one of the recipes was, okay, I think it's Isırgan. Isırgan's the Turkish word for nettle, and it's Isırgan bagulamasi, something like that. I'm probably butchering it. And it's just cooked nettles with some mild cheese, but the kicker is that you steam them. And I'd never tried steaming nettles before. I'd say most people are going to blanch them just because that's the way that most people will show you how to remove the stinger. But there's a bunch of different ways. Steaming is one of them. And when you steam nettles, you are going to taste the flavor. It is going to be so much stronger than when you're blanching them. Because when you're blanching them, a lot of that flavor and like the nutritious solutes and stuff goes out into the water.
Yep.
So when I steam common nettles, I taste that kind of saline, almost like oceanic quality so much more. I rarely blanch nettles now, and I just steam them because they taste so much better. Wood nettles, when I steam wood nettles, I don't know if you guys have those
We
over
do
in
actually.
Maine.
I have a little stand in my backyard. Actually, it
Oh
grows
man,
right off of a beaver dam got so much soil in it that they grow right up in the center of the dam.
okay. Well, you have to try this with wood nettles because it's a really cool way to taste the differences in these two plants. So common nettles, they have kind of this like oceanic taste to them. Wood nettles are completely different. And if you blanch the two and eat them side by side, you're not going to notice at all. But if you steam wood nettles,
Oh wow!
it's the flavor is like it's like perfume. The best thing that I can come up with is it's like eating greens that taste like apple blossoms
Wow!
in a
Okay.
leafy green. Yeah,
Yeah.
I was floored. Like I could not believe that this plant I've been eating for so long, I was covering up or I was removing like its true
Extracting, right?
flavor.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, but
Yeah.
it's almost the flavor is almost so strong. Some people probably won't like it. I mean, that's how strong
Wow.
the perfume is on wood nettles.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. I never would have thought that. I guess.
Yep.
Tell me if you agree. This is kind of how I picture nettles. It's like because they have that really irritating sting. It's like they don't need to have all of those unpleasant compounds flavor wise that would normally push away, herbivores. So it's like they're able to have this really easy to eat flavor. Um, Whereas, like, a lot of times we want to extract some of that off of a plant because maybe it's too bitter or it's too pungent or whatever it is. But with them, it's like they taste great anyway. I mean, they taste great raw if you can get around those stings, right? So that's really neat that there would be this even that they taste even better if you do it that way. So you're just putting them in like a steam basket or something like that.
Yeah, I'll put them in a steam basket, or if you don't have a steam basket, you could just take like a big pasta pot and put like, a finger's in like an inch of water in the bottom and put the lid on and just turn the heat on high and then just cook it until like the liquid's evaporated, and that'll basically give you an approximation of steaming them too. But yeah, I mean, we know that, you know, everything in nature, every plant, every part of a plant, every attribute, it's there for a reason. And I think it totally makes sense to me that, they're putting energy into the stingers as their defense so they don't have to have, the bitter taste or a hot taste to deter herbivores. It makes complete sense. I never thought about that way.
Yeah, it just seems like a different defense strategy. So you're going to put those in a steamer and then little salt, little oil kind of a thing. Like how would you serve those?
I mean, most of the time we have them so simply because they don't need a lot. We'll just
I
take them out of
agree.
the steamer, put them in a bowl, a little pat of butter at the table, and a sprinkle of salt, and I mean they don't need anything else.
Yep. I agree, man. I love to eat really simply because I think that there's such a richer experience very often. I mean, I love to go out to a nice dinner and see what chefs are doing. I mean, I really enjoy that, but wow, at home, it's like simple food is so nice. So that's really cool, man. So Nettles gonna come first, and let's keep going. I want to kind of go through your spring green regimen because I really want people here. A couple things I'm hoping for. One, I know a lot of our listeners are already foraging, and they're also getting excited for this. So I want them to hear how you think about it. As your moniker is the Forager Chef. You've got that culinary background that really informs how you do things. Then I think we have a lot of folks who hunt and fish who are just wanting to kind of get started foraging. And I want those folks to be inspired to really start this year. And then I think we have listeners too who just like the show, but don't necessarily, really do many of these things, but they like the show anyway. And I want them to feel like, hey man, this is something I can really do here. There's greens that I can access. This is a really low barrier to entry. So let's say after your nettles, what else are you thinking? You mentioned leeks. I'd love to talk about that because I've seen you do some pretty interesting things like
Oh
vacuum
yeah,
seal fermentations and things like
yep,
that.
yeah. No, I got some great ones. The ramp leaves. One thing I think about with ramp leaves that I think people may overlook is a lot of times we see onions as like a seasoning, right? And the best part about ramps for me is the giant green leaves.
Hmm.
So think about cooking ramp leaves like as a vegetable,
Yes.
like
Yes.
just cooking them in a large amount and not using them as a seasoning, just eating them all by themselves.
They're
You
substantial.
Oh, they're so good. I mean, you take your ramp leaves, cut them into like 1 or 2 inch pieces, and just cook them until they're tender and they taste good to you. And they're so good like that. And
Sweet, I would
so
say.
good.
There's such a
Oh, yeah.
sweetness in them. Yeah. That's one where I've done because sometimes it'll be like right around turkey season. And so I'll end up at these hunter parties. And so I'll cook those for folks. And I think they're expecting maybe like the bitterness of dandelion greens or something like that, or they're expecting not to like it, I guess, hunters who don't forage. And then I'll serve these up and everybody's like, where do I find a patch of these? How do I get some of these? And also I think a lot of folks get so focused on the bulbs they don't realize kind of like how good those greens can be, even if you live in like I know where you are, you guys have a really substantial amount of ramps, so you can take bulbs without really worrying about the colonies. But out here, it's like we're so sparse. I don't really take any bulbs. I'm taking just leaves, but even just that, they are one of my favorite. It just makes it one of the best parts of the year.
Yeah. And I mean, even though I live in a place where, we have so many ramps that we actually filmed the culinary portion of Sam Thayer's Ramp Leaf documentary that I'm super excited to see. Last year, we filmed in one of the big patches. Uh, I don't harvest many bulbs because it's a pain to clean them. I got to bring a shovel. They're just mud puppies when the ground is all wet in the spring. With the leaves, a lot of times I don't even need to wash them when I bring back. If I make sure
Yep.
to cut them a little higher,
Hmm.
I can just walk around and fill up a bag. Or a lot of times I'm going out and filling up bus tubs or Rubbermaid containers. I'm harvesting greens in massive quantities, uh, but I don't feel a need to take many bulbs because I love the leaves so much. Ooh, real quick, since you talked about fermenting them, one thing that I came up with that is super cool for everyone wants to like keep that ramp flavor year round. A really fun way to do that is you take a bunch of ramp leaves. Um, and I have some exact proportions on my site here. And you chop them up, and then you pour soy sauce over them, and the ramp leaves kind of dilute the salt content enough where it allows it to lacto ferment, and the soy sauce ferments with all the ramp leaves in it, and then you can strain it out, and you have ramp soy sauce, or you can
No
puree
way.
it up. Oh, it is so good. So you get the flavor of ramps, you get the concentrated flavor from the fermentation, and that, everything married with soy sauce that, will make just about anything taste good. So you can strain it out and just have the sauce, or you can puree it up and it'll be a little more thick. And any way you do it, it is so good.
Man, that's funny you say that, because one of the things, the way I've typically preserved them is to pulse them in olive oil with some salt, and then I'll pack jars and freeze those, and then just, there's always one going in my fridge. And my most favorite way to use it is with soy sauce. I'll use like a namashoyu, and that a bit of that, it's more greens than even a pesto. It's like mostly leek greens. And then I'll mix those two with, like, say, some rice or something like that. And I just love that flavor combination of leek and soy sauce. So I'd never thought to do that. So is there a recipe on your, I also want to say your website is such a great resource. I go there pretty frequently, and I'm often printing recipes off of there, because you do a lot of experimentation and develop out some pretty awesome recipes that are reliable. So, but anyway, so that's on your website. I could find that there.
Yep, it's just fermented ramp leaf soy sauce.
And tell people the domains just so they know, because it's such a good resource.
It's foragerchef.com.
Right on. Yeah, cool. I'm going to do that this year, because I've got piles of that namashoyu, and that sounds like a fun way to. I've never thought about using soy sauce as the salt component to lacto ferment. That's a fantastic idea.
I tried to put it together because I was like, oh, maybe I can just make the soy taste like ramps. And then it started to ferment, and I smelled it, and I'm like, oh, this is going to be even better.
That is so cool, man.
Yeah. Another question I get a lot is, how do I dry ramp leaves? When you dry them, sometimes they just come out and they're kind of like, they seem soft, and they're not easy to powder, so you can use them to season things. So I've done this a bunch of different ways, and I feel like I really cracked the code last year. But to dry ramp leaves, to get them like crisp so that they'll break up in a spice grinder, the key is all about the temperature that you're dehydrating them at. So you can't just like string them up and let them dry. They're never going to get crisp enough. So you really got to dry them. Yep, you really got to dry them at like 145, 150 Fahrenheit in a dehydrator. And just, if you don't have a temperature gauge on it, just crank it to high and leave them in there until they're really brittle. And a lot of people have kind of those small dehydrators. I have two like massive ones. And even with those, I wasn't able to dry enough for my needs. So I took a gamble, and what I did was take the leaves, and I figured if I could get the heat high enough with leaves tied up, like a whole bunch of leaves tied up into bundles, if I got the heat high enough, they wouldn't rot in there, and it actually worked like a charm.
So
now I take my leaves. Yep, I take my leaves and I make like a stack of them, and then I tie the stack of them with twine, and I can dry
like a bundle of sage or tobacco or something, like how you
exactly. Yeah, it'll kind of look like a ramp smudge.
Okay.
And I just dry that whole thing, and I can dry like 3 to 4 times the amount of ramp leaves at a time that I would be able to do before just putting the leaves flat into a dehydrator.
And so then you'll powder those down and use them. Tell me a little bit like how those would get used practically throughout the year.
Yeah, so I'll dry them, and then I'll just crumble them. And when I'm going to use them, I'll probably grind them up in a molcajete, kind of that hand spice grinder, so that they're ground right before I'm putting them into something. And I really love them in soup and in rubs.
Tell me a little bit about what Sam's working on, the documentary, and the scope of that. He had mentioned it to me maybe about a year and a half ago, but I don't even remember really what he was telling me, or if it had been a fully fledged out idea at that time.
Yeah, I think they may still have a few things to film, but my friend Jesse that I filmed my show with, he's actually working with Sam on it, so it's going to be beautiful. First and foremost, I mean, Jesse won the James Beard Award for his first feature film, so it'll be gorgeous. And Sam's going to cover basically everything you wanted to know about ramps, sustainability. They're really focusing on like how many ramp bulbs can you take from a private patch, and can it actually be good for the patch, can you increase the amount of ramps and harvest the bulbs at the same time?
It's funny how ramps, it's like they are the litmus test for all of this stuff when it comes to like what Sam calls ecoculture, or, this like idea of tending the wild or foraging, or however you want to talk about it. It's like when you talk about invasive species, it seems for me like Japanese knotweed is always the poster child for like what can happen with invasive species. And then it seems like when we're talking about native species that we want to conserve, for whatever reason, it's like ramps are the one. Maybe it's because they're so popular in the culinary world. Maybe it's like they're the breakout from the wild world into the culinary environment. But it seems like ramps, if you're going to do a documentary on it, it seems like ramps are the one. So that's really cool, because this is like one of those areas too where people get like really in each other's face about it.
Oh, totally.
Well, you've seen, no doubt too. Like sometimes I'll go to places and I will see just a horrible like commercial practices that are just shocking. Somebody who's like not thinking about the future of making money. They're thinking about making their money that season, I guess, because they really clean an area out. And then I see other people where they act like you can never touch a bulb ever, which is like, okay, you're taking that a little far. People have been eating those bulbs a really long time. So, getting some kind of a balanced approach. And do you think that documentary is going to help to kind of not just clear the air on ramps, but maybe be really good for the foraging world in general?
Yeah, I mean, as far as clearing the air, I think it will in some ways. One of the things that's so difficult when you're talking about ramps with people is that, we know it's bad to over harvest stuff. We know it's bad to clear out an entire patch, but we don't have there's not studies, at least that I have seen, with hard data and numbers over spans of many years documenting exactly, what, where, and why. And Sam is actually, doing studies on plots of his that he's been watching for years. And I think that's going to be like the first of its kind. But as far as like harvesting the bulbs and that stuff, it will obviously apply only to like private patches and not public land. So the whole public land harvesting thing is still going to be, kind of a quagmire.
As is, yeah. It's as we watch foraging get some mainstream appeal. That seems like that's just gonna be a challenge. I mean, I had some friends on recently on the show. They are foraged .market, and so they're like an Etsy for foraged things. And you can have a seller page there, but you can also buy products there. And they came on the show and they were just talking about how there are people who are so angry at them. Like people who are so anti-foraging to a level that's like kind of surprising to me, like that people take this on as their cause. But now, it's growing. So of course there's going to be that. It's just something I expect in hunting, but I'm always kind of surprised in foraging.
Yeah, I think it'll always be there. But one thing it's, good to take into account, I actually just got some stuff from them this week, and, lots of people sell ramps. They also sell Allium vineale, which is an invasive onion.
Yeah. Where is that at? We don't have that out here.
I think that was from, it was in Appalachia somewhere. I don't remember exactly. I know there's some.
I'm sorry, but I do love the idea of an invasive onion. It's like, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we can take invasive species and turn them into a cash crop, I mean, I do not see any problem with that at all. And, if people can see that there's more wild onions out there than ramps, then that's a good thing.
Yeah. Wow. Sometimes you just want a little invasion. So moving on from, or unless there's anything else you want to say about ramps or any other ideas for folks.
No, that's good.
Yeah. Okay. Let's take us to the next one. What else you got on your radar? We'll get back to the show in a moment, but first, Season 2 of our TV show WildFed is now on the air. That's right, 10 new episodes are airing on Outdoor Channel Monday nights at 7:30 p.m. Eastern and again at 10:30 p.m. Our 6th episode just aired, featuring a giant bluefin tuna fishing trip in the Gulf of Maine and an opportunity to gather ocean water to make our own sea salt. The whole episode culminates in an intimate sushi dinner with my wife and a few friends, where we're lucky enough to have several incredible preparations of bluefin made by a very talented local chef. Next Monday, we're in Arizona, where I've drawn a javelina archery tag near Sedona's famous Red Rocks. And while we bow hunt, we'll also gather an assortment of winter desert plants for tea and to flavor our meal. It's a beautiful episode you won't want to miss. Hey, if you don't have cable, and let's face it, most of us don't, you can watch the show live as it airs on friendlytv.com. That's spelled friendly without vowels, FRNDLYTV.com, and you can get a free trial subscription if you want to just watch this Monday's episode. After that, it's just $6.99 a month. Here at WildFed, we're so proud to have a second season on the air, and we really hope you'll tune in either on Outdoor Channel or friendlytv.com. Now, back to the show.
Last year, I ate my first Virginia bluebells. And those were, I think, along with ramps, probably they have to be like my favorite ephemeral to eat.
Let's talk real quick about what ephemerals are so people get that too, because that is kind of what we're talking about.
Yeah, well, the ephemerals would be different from like nettles or something. They're plants that are going to come up and, you know, finish their life cycle quickly before the trees leaf out and kind of get in quick, get that sunshine, and, you know, photosynthesize, make their energy, and then go back under the ground and hang out until the next year. So they're kind of fleeting. Spring beauty is another really good one. I just call spring beauty miner's lettuce because it's a Claytonia, just like miner's lettuce that would have to be grown as an annual here.
Spring beauty is in the same genus as miner's lettuce?
Yeah, they're both Claytonia.
Oh.
Yeah, Claytonia perfoliata and Claytonia virginica.
God, you have an incredible capacity for the Latin. That's really cool. I didn't realize that. Yeah, as you mentioned, nettles, not ephemeral, but a lot of these plants that we find in those floodplains are. And would you include the dwarf ginseng? Is probably in that category. Huh? That's one I'm thinking a lot about this year. It's on my mind.
Yeah, I haven't worked with ginseng at all. I mean, honestly, I'm almost like afraid to touch it.
Oh no, the dwarf ginseng though. Have you seen that plant?
I haven't.
Okay, so this is another spring ephemeral, and the ginseng rhizome is like about the size of a chickpea. It's got all of the same ginsenosides as like American ginseng, and even the leaves of it are super rich in it. But this is like a little dwarf plant. It's probably 4 inches off the ground, and then it comes out, flowers, and does its whole thing really quickly. But anyway, just a really awesome plant if you haven't got to play with it. But anyway, moving on. Tell us about the Virginia bluebell. I'm just looking at pictures of it right now, and I'm seeing it. You know, in the photos I'm looking at, I'm seeing it in flower, but I imagine you're talking about the greens, or does it flower early?
The whole time. So they'll start out as a leafy green, and then as they get bigger, it becomes like a vegetable, and you get this big juicy stem. And I mean, the flowers are edible. The whole thing's edible. It's in the borage family. I mean, I know not all of everything in the Boraginaceae is going to be edible. Like, comfrey, people are going to make sure to tell you that, oh, that's not an edible, but if you eat it in small amounts, like in the Italian recipe I was talking about before, it's just fine. I eat comfrey flowers all the time, but it's in the borage family. So what it translates to me is the flavor. I taste borage in the flavor. It's almost like an oystery, rich taste. Borage has more of a stronger taste than Virginia bluebells, but you can definitely taste that botanical family relation, and they're both really great greens.
And that'll be more of like a salad green, or will you steam that, or how are you going to use it?
I don't eat a lot of raw greens. I mean, I'm out to consume mass quantities. I've been eating meat. I've been eating venison, lamb, and mutton all winter. And it's like, okay, it looks like dinner's another pile of meat with a side of meat. And we eat lots of vegetables too, but they're cultivated. And I want to get out and just eat big bowls of cooked plants.
Yeah, I know what you
mean. Most of the time around the world, you see recipes here and there for salads. But like we were talking a lot about, a lot of the plants, they may have stronger flavors. And most of them around the world, wild plants are going to be cooked. Makes it easier to digest. And personally, I typically cook most of my wild greens because it's easier to eat larger quantities of them. I will easily put down 8 ounces of cooked greens in a single meal easily.
Yeah, this time of year it's like a cleanse, right? From the winter as you push all that
Absolutely.
chlorophyll-rich greens through. I'm reading a book right now in preparation for having the author on the show, and it's about it's sort of like the culinary anthropology. So it's the history of food in the human past, I think is the name of the book. And one of the things they're talking about is cooking, as it's so fundamental to the human story, and that I believe it was they were talking about studies done with apes. I can't remember if it was gorillas or chimpanzees. I think chimpanzees, but anyway, they were saying that if given the option, they'll prefer cooked foods, and even if there's raw foods available, they will wait for the cooked food if they know it's coming. And so, uh, you know, this idea that like raw foods are better for you, it's like, well, we actually get quite a bit more nutrition in generally speaking, out of properly cooked food. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I like the same thing. A huge bowl of cooked greens is very exciting to me. I'm somebody too, like when I sit down at a restaurant, I'm often looking at the sides to down at the bottom of the menu to be like, can I get like a bowl of just like steamed vegetable material? It's like it
Yes,
helps me
give
digest
me
what's
two
in there.
sides of greens in one bowl.
Yeah, exactly it. I think that's definitely important. I want to mention your pickled fiddlehead recipe. Every year, I have it actually printed out and in a file because every year I break that thing out to do my fiddleheads, to can up my pickled fiddleheads, and then I use for ostrich fern, and I use those throughout the year. So I just wanted to give you a chance to talk about fiddleheads because at least here in Maine, that's for us that happens before we're getting those before we get our ramps, and we get it's just like such a iconic cultural thing here. And so a lot of times people just cook them, and but knowing that you can do a crunchy, crispy pickle that lasts all year is pretty exciting to me.
Yeah, and fiddleheads are tricky because they're hard to preserve. And anybody who has like blanched fiddleheads and frozen them will know that if you do that, it's like a bowl of mush. They just it's not good. So I pickle them and I hot pack them. Technically the FDA would poo poo turning jars upside down and allowing them to seal, but it works. And I know people who have put up like 50 pounds at a time using that recipe, and it's probably the best way that I've found uh, to keep the texture and keep them crunchy. When I'm at restaurants, I would just fill up like giant Cambros and we just blanch them and pour the pickle liquid over them cold and keep them in the fridge, and they're even better like that. But putting them into a jar is kind of the closest approximation. If you haven't tried it, and this is one I learned from Linda Black Elk, who's a friend of mine, she knows so much stuff, is dehydrating fiddleheads is pretty cool too. So then that takes us to, uh, you know, Asian food and Korean food specifically, because that is how most of the bracken ferns around the world are going to be consumed. But you can do it with ostrich fern fiddleheads too, and I think it's even better.
Well, I was gonna so talk to us a little bit about that, and then I do want to talk about bracken fern because yeah, I just feel like it's such a misunderstood food here, and it's one that I just look forward to all year. I love the texture of it. I love the cherry aroma when you're cooking it. I love the length of it. Like it's like asparagus to me in that nice long length, but it has that kind of furry texture that is so unique to it. So I just love bracken fern, and it's one of those foods where every year people are going to tell you you're not supposed to eat it. It's a carcinogen. You're going to hear all those kind of things. So I'd love to hear about the dehydrating of ferns in general, but also specifically your thoughts on bracken fern and how you might work with it.
Yeah, absolutely. So to dry the fiddleheads, well, so with all the fiddleheads that I've cooked, you can't just if you undercook them and they turn dark, that's no good. If you don't blanch them and you put them in a dehydrator, they're going to discolor and you're going to see that oxidization and it's not going to look pretty. That being said, most of the dried ferns, all of the dried ferns that I've ever seen sold in an Asian market are all just dehydrated and they're all discolored like that. So if you blanch them, just real quick, like a minute and then let them cool naturally. Don't put them in ice water because there's not going to be that residual heat that will help them not oxidize. Blanch them, let them cool naturally, put them in a dehydrator until they're crisp, and then put them into a jar. And then you can simmer them in a little bit of water until they're tender, and that's it.
You blanch them, and then would you like salad spin them? You're going to dry them off, obviously, so you salad spin them,
Yeah, you let them
or
drain
something like
the
that.
colander or
But
whatever.
you don't ice bath them. So the idea is not to stop the cooking process, really, to let that continue on. So they're going to cool at room temperature, and then they're just going into the dehydrator. Huh?
Yep, absolutely.
And
And
then they'll
I
stay
never,
whole, or do you
yes, they'll
break
stay
them?
whole.
And so then you reconstitute them or something.
Yep. So I'll cut the stems into like 1 inch lengths
Okay.
and blanch everything so that they're even. And then I'll reconstitute them, simmer them in just a little bit of water just until they're tender. And then you can add them to stuff. They may unravel a little bit, but if you look at like traditional ways of how they're consumed, it'll be like in a pile on, and I'm probably going to mispronounce it, but the bibimbap,
Oh, yeah.
the super traditional, the Korean dish with the rice and all the little garnishes. So it works really, really well like that.
Talk to me about Bracken Ferns specifically, and what are your thoughts on the general anxiety people have about them as a food, and how they should be prepared?
Yeah, I don't eat a ton of them just because there's not patches near me that I've found where they're growing in massive quantities. I eat a few here and there, and I think they're great. They're so pretty, just like you said.
Yeah.
Uh, and yeah, I mean, I really think it's important to balance new science and studies that come out with ethnobotanical traditional knowledge, because a lot of times these are documentation for food plants being used. It can predate Western medicine, you know? So we can't just disregard traditional knowledge and traditional uses of plants when some new thing comes out that says this is a carcinogen, bacon's a carcinogen, everything's a carcinogen. I think that we absolutely need to look at the studies that say, oh, people are getting throat cancer in Korea when they're eating dried bracken fern every single day of the year, which is an exaggeration, but that's where they eat the most of them. I think it's important to look at that stuff. Uh, Maybe don't eat bracken ferns every day. For the vast
Yeah,
majority of
exactly.
people, they're not eating bracken ferns every day. It's like a once a year thing. That's it's up and gone relatively quick. The other thing, and this relates to the blanching and dehydrating, when you see the bracken ferns, warabi, that might be the Japanese name. Gosari, that should be. I'm probably mixing them up, but those are two different names for them. When you see bags of them, how they are sold in Asian markets, they are all discolored. Okay, so it, I think it kind of follows from there that means that are these industrial companies going to blanch their bracken ferns before they dehydrate them? No, they're going to put them straight. They're going to dry them straight up from the
Mm.
raw state, which is why they get discolored. So what I would like to see is a comparison of people that eat bracken, and this will probably never happen, but I'd like to see, for example, a comparison of people that eat blanched, dehydrated bracken ferns next to bracken ferns dehydrated from raw, because I think some of those compounds are probably water soluble,
Yep.
you know? So I would probably I blanch my bracken ferns before I eat them. But like I said, I think it's really important to balance, new science and studies with traditional knowledge and find that balance, because we can't just demonize a plant because one new thing came out that said, oh, this could possibly contribute to something. I mean, take a look and read everything for sure, but keep in mind that it's not always so simple.
Yeah, and it's easy to cherry pick, especially like one compound out of a plant, and be like, yeah, maybe that compound on its own, but like let's look at it in the totality, because then you end up with these situations like people being afraid of choke cherry, and then you head out to sort of the prairie and you see that this is like one of the fundamental foods to the human diets out there, and had been for thousands of years, and the people were so
Yeah,
healthy and robust.
and the same thing with bracken fern. And I think, I mean, I was just in the Pacific Northwest doing a new show this year, and I was talking to a guy who is, uh, he's involved with a bunch of the tribes out there, and bracken fern rhizomes have been heavily consumed out there
Wow, I've
for a
never even dug
very
one up.
long time.
I don't think I've ever dug one.
Yeah, and the ferns, they as he explained it to me, the rhizomes should be much larger than the ones that you and I are probably familiar with. And they would take these rhizomes and like bash them up and somehow like extract starch. Like the old references say they bake it into a bread. And
Hmm.
when people are saying bread like 100 years ago, that could like translate to take some mush, make it into a patty, and cook it on a hot stone.
Yep.
You know, but still they're consuming a part of the bracken fern. I don't know if the rhizomes contain the same compounds, but that has been a traditional food for a very, very long time. And just like you said. So I mean there's another example of bracken ferns, and like I said, I don't know if they contain the same compounds as the above ground portions, but they've been food for a super long time.
Wow, that's fascinating, man. I've never heard of that. You're right too. I just want to kind of reiterate and echo what you said, because you'll see that reference a lot, bake a bread. And obviously we're not talking about fluffy leavened glutinous breads. We're talking about like, yeah, a little like hard pack. But that's,
Hardtack.
yeah, hardtack, which prior to the incredible dietary opulence we live in today was like one of the most common things probably eaten throughout the world. People were making this kind of thing out of whatever was starchy on their landscape. I mean, it's so common to see those kind of references, particularly in the ethnographies and stuff. Yeah, talk to me about any other sort of spring greens that come to mind, or spring forageables that you're thinking about.
Well, kind of along the same line of greens is spring is also a great time to get your roots before the plants start
Mm,
to make
that's
their
true.
leaves. It's spring and fall. I prefer the spring. So, spring is when I'm going to go. I have a place where I've been kind of helping them remove some of the burdock, and I'll get some wild parsnip. And those roots are really, really great. A new one for me this year. Uh, when I was filming that show, I can't talk too much about it. Basically, I was in the wilderness for the better part of a week without food, water, shelter, or a sleeping bag. And I had to gather wild ingredients for like an Iron Chef competition at the end. And I was in an old growth coniferous forest full of alder, and I had no idea where I could find any edible plants. It was just a sea of ferns. And I found a construction dump next to part of by where we were filming. And that was where my wild greens came from. But one I saw was, I'm pretty sure they were bull thistles, but it was in the fall. So I was like, oh, these are in the basil rosette stage. I'm pretty sure they're going to have an edible root. I dug up these thistle roots, and I have to tell you, they were so good. And the judges at the end agreed with me. Like no one could believe that they were eating a thistle root. It was tender, it was delicious, it
Is
was
it a
not bitter.
taproot?
Yes,
Okay.
just like the burdock or a parsnip.
Hmm. Yep.
So you see the big. It was like one of those big, aggressive looking thistle rosettes,
Yeah.
and I just chopped the tops off. And it's like a carrot that tastes like an artichoke, because artichokes are also a thistle.
Ooh, oh, man, because yeah, I've got a walking path out in my backyard, and often there'll be that big basil rosette you're talking about. Let's describe what that means to people. So when we say that, what's a basil rosette?
It's going to be you're testing me here. It's going to be a circular formation of leaves that will be before the plant makes the flower stalk.
Yeah. So you'll see kind of that, like, yeah, like a whirl of leaves come out of the ground. And you see this with so many plants, like that stage before basically this, I know I'm not using botanical language here, but before it shoots up, you're going to see that sort of basil rosette. So I'll have those in my backyard because I'll step on them barefoot. That's why I'm always like, now I'm going
Yeah,
to
and
bring a digging
usually,
stick out and pull some of those up.
yeah, and I just avoided them because I was like, oh, thistles.
Yeah. Right.
I would avoid. There's some wild food literature will talk about like, oh, like cut the spines off, cut the stickers off, cut the needles off, eat the inner portion of the leaf. They're not that good.
They're not,
But
and
the
it's one of those
roots,
things where you feel like, man, am I expending more calories and nutrition doing this than I get out of it? I mean, I've done it too,
yeah,
and it's like, it's not really. That's like some real survival stuff right there, but not like necessarily something interesting culinary to me.
yeah, no, the roots though were fantastic. I mean, not
Cool.
stringy or any. I thought they were going to be really stringy, and they were soft like a artichoke crossed with a carrot.
So you can't really talk about it, but it sounds like we might get to see you compete in some kind of a survival meets wild food culinary competition. how
Yeah,
much what
absolutely.
how
And
much
it
can
was
you
one of
say?
the hardest. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done. The only thing I ate nothing but uh, oysters so large that some of them would not fit in my mouth, and handfuls
Oyster
of seaweed.
mushrooms or actual? Oh yeah, actual oysters.
Straight up oysters. Yeah,
Oh, dude, whenever I
they
watch
were
a show
this
like that, I'm like,
huge.
give me access to the coast. I'm gonna be okay. If I
Yeah,
can just get
they're
near the
crazy.
salt water. When will that come out?
It should be it should be a couple months yet. It's tons of editing for them to do.
Right. Oh, fantastic, man. Is it one episode or multiple?
It should be an hour long episode. Should be episode 2 in a season.
Can't wait. That's really exciting, man. Oh,
Yeah, it
congratulations.
should be pretty good.
And what about the other show you were doing? You were doing the sort of that internet-based show.
Yeah, the Wild Harvest. Yeah, it just won. It won a Taste Award for best online food show
Really?
just a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, man. And how many episodes did you end up doing, and are you still doing it?
We did like I want to say we did like 6, and it actually just got picked up by a streaming service, and they're going to give it a run and see how it performs and see if they want to order another season. So that'd be cool.
Congratulations, dude. That's exciting, man. I'm watching several friends and colleagues kind of where we share these interests, and like again when I brought up earlier that I feel like it's starting to break into the mainstream. I mean, for me to get WildFed on the air and to be foraging on a channel that has been strictly hunting and fishing for so long is just so cool to me. And then
It's fantastic.
simultaneously to look around and see all my other friends are on these projects, and they're getting picked up and they're getting distributed, and it's like, okay, this is like really happening. It's really cool because for one of us to do it would have been like a one-off, but when a bunch of us are doing it, it means that there's general interest. And I'm such a big believer in that, like, this kind of Coke and Pepsi mentality where it's like, hey, we're all gonna distribute more of our content if there's competition in a sense, because that just means that there's enough viewers to be interested in their can support multiple shows or
Yeah,
multiple whatever it is. And so it's just really exciting to me because it means that this kind of thing that's been so important to us all is starting to become important at a mainstream level. And that's man, that's pretty powerful. So
absolutely. No, you know the old saying, a rising tide floats all ships or floats all
yeah.
boats. And the show that I was on that'll come out, I mean, it was impressive for me to see because it just confirms that everything that we've been talking about. Because this show, it's going to be the first like big show that I know of where the entire thing is based around foraging, the whole thing.
Wow.
And I'm not talking about a small show. There was at least 70 people on set.
Wow.
Uh,
Oh,
I mean,
cool.
COVID protocols. Every single person on set had to get tested for COVID every other day. I would say it's probably like $15,000 to $20,000 a week in COVID alone
Wow.
costs. It's like the scale was just insane. I mean,
Yeah.
millions of dollars in budget. So it's a great sign for where wild food's going, I think.
Wow, we're going to be dealing with really new challenges too, because it kind of like for everybody to hunt who wants to hunt or fish who wants to fish. Of course, it requires not just a lot of legislation and a lot of but there you also need the enforcement wing, like all this kind of stuff in order the conservation side, the science side, the biologists, all of that. It'll be interesting as we, you know, I I keep telling the story, but Grant, who our producer at WildFed, he and I were in Florida recently. We're coming out of this Whole Foods, and on the walk out, there's just so many products now, and I don't remember what the product was, but it was like, Shanti Om bars or something like that. And we were just kind of like shaking our heads like, oh my gosh, this stuff's getting ridiculous. And we step outside and I look at him and I go like, this is what we wanted. This is what we worked so hard to create. Now it's here and we're both kind of like annoyed by it, where it's like, there was no organic, there was no like health food, there was definitely no mega health food supermarkets. And I've watched that whole thing come up and grow. And it's at a point now where I get annoyed by how huge it is. And it's really funny to me, because I'm like, am I going to be in 10 years, like shaking my head because there's, these big wild food markets, or like this, how big are we going to get this thing? What will it become? But at the same time, it's like, it's just so important, at least for there to be the awareness of it, so yeah, it's pretty exciting, but we're going to have to be thoughtful as we move forward to make sure that we're doing it in a way that can be sustained and that we feel good about.
Yeah, I think the conversation just needs to keep going, and the more conversations, the more we can get stuff like needed regulation for like harvesting wild plants. In most places around the United States, it's probably illegal to go to a park and harvest nettles and bring them home and cook them, even though nettles are a non-native invasive species. There is nothing wrong with going to a piece of public land and harvesting a non-native invasive plant and eating it, But, I mean, California is a good example. It's really hard to find any places you can get wild food there. Wild fennel is like a scourge. It's everywhere, And I really hope that bringing some more regulation into the conversation can help, give more people more access to free food.
Yeah, because we don't want it to become this thing where it's like hunting in England. Like to hunt in
Totally.
England, unlike here, you need to know landowners and you need to have connections in it, and that can cause it to become a bit of a classist thing. And that's what's so weird, is to imagine, I've had this headline in my head for so many years because I saw it back in the day when I was first becoming interested in wild foods, but it was talking about some developing nation that had just had a kind of a economic disaster, and it talked about the locals being reduced to foraging. And I always thought that was really funny, but at the same time, this idea of like, what is our basic survival subsistence, that it could become not just a classist thing, but where you have to have like wealth in order to be able to participate in a thing that some people think of as being reduced to, if that makes sense. It's like this common denominator of humans. So the idea that you'd have to have wealth or connection to wealthy landholders in order to forage seems counterintuitive to me. But do you have any kind of ideas or visions for what it could look like to start to create sensible regulation for this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to see a plant license, just like how people get licenses so they can pick wild mushrooms in the Pacific Northwest. You you get a license. There's some different plants that you can harvest. They're probably all non-native invasive species, and some of them, maybe it's open season. There's open season on garlic mustard. Take all the garlic mustard you want.
Take it
Personally,
all.
I can't stand this stuff. I don't eat much of it at all because I end up picking so much of it. It just kind of ruins me for it. But it could be similar to hunting, where you pay $20 a year or something, and then you can go to a park and pick nettles. I think that'd be great.
It would open up a whole new field for botanists, because you'd need this like botanical enforcement wing, like a warden, but who understands the botany, or who can at least key out what the plant. Because otherwise, like, you could be walking out with a native plant and telling somebody, oh, no, it's garlic mustard. It's like, so there'd have to be some way for that to actually, somebody who can oversee that, but they would have to have botanical knowledge, which, compared to a warden learning 15 or 20 species, or most wardens have grown up hunting, so they already know those species that are regulated as game or sport. But like, the idea of having to learn all those plants is overwhelming to a lot of people. So you'd have to have almost like these empowered botanists who are out there as like a, I don't know. I mean, do you see that, or do you think that's kind of silly? Like, do you?
No, well, they have to have some way to figure out, like, okay, we're going to look at your fish, we're going to look at your greens. There'd
Mhm.
be a higher level of learning with that. And it's, yeah, I mean, I don't think there's an easy answer. I, I think, like everything else, the way there will probably be pretty painful. I actually got stopped by a warden last year who was looking for people catching fish, and I had my big foraging pack on, and I had I had a number of different things. I had fiddleheads. I had, I actually had plenty of native plants that I was going to eat. And he stopped me. He said, "What's in the bag?" And I was like, "Oh shoot, here comes the ticket." And what it turned into is me, instead of getting a ticket, I showed him all of the edible plants and why I was harvesting the way I was, how I was, probably positively impacting the landscape in some small scale by taking out some of the things that shouldn't be there. Uh, and it was actually pretty cool.
That's really cool. And then, because like beautiful, the idea of it's always so nice to like educate and share and open up somebody's eyes to something that they hadn't seen was there before. But we're talking on that small scale. So yeah, as this thing grows, because every episode of our show that comes out, every episode of your show that comes out, every episode of, this show you're kind of hinting at that's coming out, that sounds like that's going to be distributed a bit more widely than some of the stuff we've done. So, it just people are going to go out and want to do this, because that's the thing is I've been looking at it for a long time. Like the inspiration that I've drawn is like, how do I make this seem, I remember before there was mountain biking, and now look how big mountain biking is, for instance, like it's like a sport or a hobby that becomes like a sport or an athletic endeavor so that it perpetuates itself. So in a similar way, or like as rock climbing became a thing or whatever it is, all these different like activities that people now do in places where people only used to basically hunt or trap, so out here in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, I'm quite close to there, where I hunt with some people. They tell me stories of like before there was any recreation there. And if you saw somebody out there, it was because they hunted. And then they were like, wow, people come out here to just walk now, like hikers. That was like a new idea, and then all these other activities that come out that you see. And there's always these new sports. And so I've been like kind of imagining like, how do I position, because I feel wild foods, there needs to continuously be attention on that, or we're just going to lose our connection to these things. So it's like, how do I position it, in the way that I share it with people, that it looks like a lifestyle activity that you can get involved in and meet all these cool people and learn all this cool information and get all this really great food, and position it a bit like that. Hopefully it doesn't require specialized shoes and specialized spandex in the future, the way most sports do, but still, how do we position it like that? But then but the success means all these people are out there doing it. And so pretty soon we're going to be dealing with that in a new way, and that'll be interesting. And it's going to, yeah, I think we're ready for it, but it's going to, you're like, for you, for instance, I mean, doing what you do with your website, with your book, with the shows you've done, you're positioned to be like a major player in that as it comes forward, man. It's like, I don't know.
I mean,
Go ahead.
We'll see. We'll see about that.
Well, I think it's kind of undeniable. I mean, you must get, like, for instance, they reached out to you to do this show. So, as this stuff grows, I mean, I'm getting reach outs all the time. I've been just asked to do, something I can't talk about yet, but like something that's going to be really major for the wild food world. And I was just asked to like, hey, do I want to be involved as a board member? It's like, wow, okay, this stuff's starting to happen. Or like, I get those reach out from all those shows like, hey, would you like to be on this show? Would you, we're interested in foraging. I get reach outs from people who don't know I have a show that want to see if I want to do a show, where it's like, what, but I already have a show. And they're like, oh, well, if you do want to do another show, and it's like, okay, this is growing really fast. And you're on that short list that I'm on. I know it. They get on Instagram. They're like, who are the foragers that are making an impact? It's like Alan Bergo is. You know what I mean? So yeah, I just think it's going to be busy for us over these coming years, and that's exciting, and it's a little scary, and it's a little fun, and I want to like not lose sight of what was the original vision. Because it's like you got these people
totally.
like you brought up Sam before, who laid the foundations for so much of this. And before him, like Yule Gibbons, maybe, these people have like
absolutely.
laid these foundations, but here it is, it's like going in this direction that is mainstream.
One thing I think that people kind of forget about a little bit is that, it doesn't always have to be completely wild. Like I bought a house in town here to use kind of as a mad scientist lab because there's so many jars of fermenting leeks you can have before, people you live with get angry at you. And I use it as a lab and a place to do work and film. And I've been trying to figure out, how can I bring the wild to me? And I think people can kind of forget that they can do that. So what I've been doing now is kind of hopefully the fruits of what I did in the fall, which is collecting lots of seeds. Will start to pay off for me. So I started collecting seeds of things that maybe I have to travel some distance to get. So I have a lot of wild caraway seeds that I'm planting. So I love wild caraway. I don't have a lot of salsify. So I have a bunch of salsify seeds. I finally found a patch of bladder campion, the collejas.
Hmm.
So I'm going to plant a whole bunch of those. And some of those things, I'll harvest like small amounts, like herbs and stuff. And some of the stuff may just be like indicators for me to go out and check my patches. Like I'll transplant some fiddlehead crowns so I can know when those are ready.
In other words,
I
yeah, it
think,
wouldn't be like you'd have enough there to sustainably harvest them, but it would tell you, hey, time to go to my spots.
yeah, but some of the stuff it will be plenty for me to harvest,
Of course, yeah.
especially with the herbs. Like my favorite wild mint. I got wild mint seeds, so I'm going to put those in where I can. So I think sometimes people forget that a lot of this stuff, you know, is I'm really bad at growing stuff. I just grew my first plant. It was chives. I'm good at
Pretty easy one.
killing plants, not growing
Yeah,
them. And
right.
wild plants, they want to grow.
On their own.
A lot of
Yeah.
a lot of them are really aggressive. So you also want to be careful about which ones specifically you're planting. Like, maybe don't put ground elder everywhere, but it's going to be harder to kill them.
One of the things that that folks of native descent here are often want to remind us is like, hey, a lot of what you're calling wild is there because people did just what you're talking about. They brought the seeds, or they spread these plants around, and really tended to this continent as if it were a garden, but more like a wild permaculture kind of a situation. So, I know the place where I harvest leeks is not in it's not a fully just natural or spontaneous colony of leeks. It was certainly tended and encouraged, and now it covers these whole islands. And so, that was a tended piece of wild. And so I just really want to second what you're saying, because I'm kind of envisioning that the future of this, I mean, because, we're on a trajectory where less and less land is going to be available for this kind of thing anyway. So I really do imagine a world where people are practicing a kind of wild tended permaculture sort of conglomerate, and creating little native ecosystems around themselves to encourage these things. Because there's going to come a point where it's not realistic for me to go out around here to get choke cherries anymore, because everything is like being posted and it's all private, or it's being damaged with chemical whatever. And so eventually I'm going to need those trees here for me to keep eating choke cherries at the quantities that I like to. So yeah, and also it's like, there's gonna, yeah, I mean, just where fuel's headed, where everything's headed, it's like, the idea of going out to do all these things may not always be realistic, or as the numbers of people doing it grow. So I appreciate what you're saying, because some kind of hybridized model for all of this makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Man, Al, it's been really cool talking to you. And as we have, there's been all these things I've wanted to plug for you, because I just think your work is really important in this community of people. So, we've talked a little bit about your show, and we've talked about your book and your website. But yeah, I just want to give you space for anything you might want to mention, because you've got a lot of work that's freely available for people to access, and God, it's been a labor for you, huh? I'm sure a labor of love, but you have put in a tremendous amount of work and left a lot of content for people to get involved in. So, where do you want to point people to your stuff? And is there anything you want to let them know you have out there?
I would just point people to wild plants. That's
Right on, buddy.
go out and try a new wild green that you haven't tried before.
Yeah, right
You
on.
know, I think that's the best thing that you can do.
and it's about to start, and there's going to be no shortage of stuff. And this season goes fast too. So I want to say that, like, this idea of these ephemerals, they're called ephemeral for a reason. And then some of the ones that aren't necessarily ephemerals, they stop being food after a little bit. So, the Bracken Ferns, the nettles, like things like that, you want to get into these things early. So right now we're at late March as we record this. So the next month and a half, 2 months, they're like really critical moments around the country. So time to get moving. Any suggestions on what to bring, gear, things like that? Like any kind of final thoughts about to make this any easier for people? I like that you mentioned the tubs, by the way. They sit nice, and I love to bring a big basket out when I go get my leeks, but they fall over. So sometimes like that tub is real handy. But like any kind of final tips for people who are going to go out and do this, make things easier.
Yeah, I mean, it's more than like a novelty. And don't bring a small basket.
Yeah.
When you go outside, don't think of it as like going for a hike. You're going to the grocery store. So be prepared to do some shopping. So, when I go to my private land patches, I'm bringing Rubbermaid tubs because I'm harvesting, for now and also throughout the year. I'll probably harvest 200 pounds of greens this year. So think of going to the grocery store. Don't think of it as going on a hike. Bring a large container. I like the really, really big woven baskets as well as my Rubbermaid tubs. And, a glove if you're sensitive to nettles, and then a really good pair of scissors.
Right on. Alan, always a pleasure, man, and just really happy for what's happening. I can't wait to see this show that you're part of, and I'm just glad to see that you're out there continuing to push the wild food cultural movement kind of forward. So thanks for all you do, and thanks for being here today. Thanks for listening to the WildFed podcast. Help us grow this show by subscribing and leaving us a rating and review. It ensures better rankings and more advertiser interest, which translates directly into better shows, more awesome guests, and a constant stream of fresh new content. Have a question you'd like answered on the show, or a hunting, fishing, or foraging trip you'd like to host us on? Email us at info@wild-fed.com. If you still haven't seen season 1 of the WildFed TV show, you can go to myoutdoortv.com, grab yourself a free trial subscription, and then check out all 10 episodes. Season 2 of WildFed premieres on Outdoor Channel in early 2022. And be sure to visit our website, wild-fed.com, to check out our store for WildFed hats, stickers, and more. WildFed. Food is all around you.